Welcome to SFU, and great to see so many people here for Amie Siegal's talk and opening of Quarry at the Audain Gallery tonight. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Melanie O'Brien, and I'm the director of SFU Galleries. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I'd just like to congratulate Amie Siegal and curator Amy Kazimierczuk on tonight's exhibition, and I'd like to invite the latter Amie up to do a more thorough introduction of Amie Siegal.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's really my pleasure to welcome American artist Amie Siegal back to Vancouver and to Simon Fraser University, both of which she is no stranger to. In November of 2010, I had invited Amie to screen her 2008 film DDR at the Cinematheque as part of the DIM Cinema program. And during her visit, Sabina Bitter, who's the associate professor in the School of Contemporary Arts here, and then curator of the Audain Gallery, had invited her to give an artist talk in this same room. 5 years later, Grant Arnold curated her 2015 multi-element installation Provenance in the group exhibition Residue, The Persistence of the Real at the Vancouver Art Gallery. And now, 18 months later, she returns to present Quarry at the Audain Gallery and to apprise us of the movement and growth in her practice. Recently, I came across a photo of the Earth taken from the moon by astronaut Michael Collins during the 1969 Apollo mission. In the picture, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong are in the lunar module in the foreground, hovering above the moon's surface, and the Earth is in the distant background. The caption reads, "Michael Collins, the astronaut who took this photo, is the only human, alive or dead, that isn't in the frame of this picture." Throughout the planning and installation of Quarry, this caption has haunted me. Rather than draw attention to what is pictured in the image, it highlights the conditions of the photo's production and invites the viewer to think about the structural apparatuses, economic, political, and technological, that made the image possible, without picturing, naming, or explaining them. I feel that Amie provokes a similar inquiry through her moving image and photographic works. Quarry is almost devoid of people and is constructed without narration or contextualization. And yet, in its presence, one becomes keenly aware of the apparatuses of power and influence that directs its lens and the worlds it captures. With this strategy in mind, it is perhaps a bit blatant to express that I was compelled to present this work because it draws attention to the mutual demands of the international real estate, luxury commodity, and primary resource markets on the Earth. And this seemed perfectly suited for a contemporary art gallery that is situated in a university within a housing development named after a mining company. I say it because I hope that, in the spirit of the Collins caption, we come to understand what makes the production and circulation of an image possible by highlighting who is situated outside its frame. Another important correlation between Quarry, Amie's practice, and SFU Gallery's program is a consideration of timescales: geologic, anthropocentric, and cinematic being three examples. Quarry's exhibition follows the production and presentation of Andreas Bunta's Erosion, curated by Melanie O'Brien at SFU Gallery, which observes the geological deposition of SFU Burnaby's Brutalist campus as an inquiry into the long-term impacts of architectural processes on the Earth. Finally, I'd like to thank some of the most important people who make the production of this exhibition possible. Our preparators, Dylan McHugh, Matt Smith, Kevin Romaniak, and Alex Stursberg, and our co-op students, Megan Wedge and Beck Wonders, for an outstanding installation. My colleagues, Cassidy Richardson, Karina Irvin, and Christina Headland for their support and care of the galleries. Sabina Bitter, Elsbeth Pratt, and the Faculty of the Contemporary Arts for their ongoing support and collaboration, and Melanie O'Brien for her inspiration and attention to the values of our program. And I'm going to welcome Amie Siegal to the podium to talk about her practice in her own words. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much to Amie for having me here, and also to Melanie. And I want to thank, in particular, Dylan and Cassidy in the gallery for doing such a fantastic install along with the rest of the team, which you can see after the talk. I'm going to speak initially about the work Provenance, which you see an image of above. And then from there, I'm going to talk about two works that are sort of divergent but connected paths that come out of Provenance. And one of them is a project called Double Negative, a recent work, and the other is Quarry, which is downstairs in the gallery. So Provenance is a multi-element film installation, or multi-element installation, as we call it, and it's from 2013. And most of my work, but with Provenance in particular, oops, I'm going to just move that one out, okay. Most of my work seeks to, in some way, perform the behaviors of the system it describes. So there's a kind of, I hesitate to say self-reflexive turn, but there's a space where the work looks back at itself, but in a performative aspect. And with Provenance, I'm going to kind of go through the different elements of the pieces and talk about how the work itself does just that. It sort of, it loops around to perform the very thing that is depicted in the work, and it becomes representative of that cycle. So what you're looking at here is an installation view, an exhibition view of the first time the work was shown, which was at Simon Preston Gallery in New York, the gallery that I work with. And you're looking at a sort of still from a 40-minute film. And the film follows the furniture that Pierre Jeanneret and Le Corbusier designed for Chandigarh, India. And Chandigarh is a very unique place because it was a planned city. So where there was arid farmland in the foothills of the Himalayas, after India became independent from British colonial rule, this is up in Punjab, the capital that was formerly in that area, which is Lahore, went to Pakistan. And so the Punjab needed a new capital. And Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru, then the first Prime Minister of India, decided, paradoxically, as sometimes happens in the sort of first throes of post-colonial glee, I guess, to turn to a Western European architect to design their post-colonial progressive new city. And that architect first was Matthew Nowicki, and Albert Mayer did the city plan at first, but then it moved entirely to Le Corbusier and his team, including Jane Drew and Maxwell Fry, and Pierre Jeanneret and other architects, and there were also 9 Indian architects involved. But this is primarily the work of Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret. And they designed everything. They designed the government buildings, the university, the residences, the street plan they adapted, the street lamps, even down to the sewer covers, which feature a design of the city on them, that sort of signature Le Corbusier, these sewer covers of the city. And they also designed the furniture. And the furniture, Provenance depicts the furniture. I was in, a couple years before I did this project, I was flipping through an auction catalog and I saw a spread of chairs across 2 pages. And they were listed they're attributed to Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret. And the provenance indicated was Chandigarh. And we all know that, or perhaps not, but I assume everybody is familiar with the term provenance, that provenance is essentially a history of of any cultural object deemed, of value, of cultural value, let's say. Any object, artifact, usually artwork, deemed of cultural value. And the provenance starts with the current owner of the object or artwork, and then moves backward in time to the work's so-called origins, meaning its first owner. And a provenance document accompanies every object, every museum object, any kind of collectible, let's say. So when I saw that the provenance was attributed to Chandigarh, and this was in a major Western auction house catalog, I got very curious about how did it get from India to this kind of auction catalog, which I believe was Bonham's. And then I started looking around online, and within 20 minutes, I realized that all of this furniture was appearing in Christie's, Sotheby's, Art Curial, Phillips de Pury, right 20th century. All the major Western auction houses were trafficking in this furniture. And they had massive amounts of it. So there was also a sort of strange illusion of rarity around the furniture. So I decided to make a project which is composed of 3 parts. And the first part is in collectors. It unfolds in the beginning in collectors' homes who have bought the furniture at auction or through interior designers or through private dealers. And so these are some of the homes, which it's all over the sort of Western capitals, let's say, of, well, this is Antwerp, the Hamptons, outside of New York, and London, Paris, Norfolk in the British countryside, Los Angeles, multiple cities, multiple locations, all of which are the film begins in these homes. And then it moves backwards in time, like a provenance document. It moves backwards from seeing the furniture in those homes to the auctions of the furniture. So here you actually are looking at an image from right 20th century, which is the major American auction house for modernist furniture. And this is a scene where they set up the photography for their auction exhibition catalog or their preview catalog. And that is indeed the furniture. This is Art Curial in Paris. So it's backward to the auctions, to the restoration, the so-called restoration of the furniture, and then to the shipping of the furniture in container ships across the ocean from India to Western Europe and North America to the auction houses. And then back to Chandigarh, where you see the furniture sort of in situ, in its so-called place of origin. So among the many places that I mentioned where we filmed in the collectors' homes, we also filmed on a yacht in the Mediterranean. So that was a private yacht, which was entirely furnished with the furniture from Chandigarh. And this is an excerpt from one of the auctions. So you can see here that they're selling off the lamps. And initially when we came into the shot, they were selling the sewer cover, actually, which went for 13,000 euro. So these pieces are going for, usually the chairs and the furniture go for somewhere between 60 and 130,000 US dollars. So after seeing the furniture at auction going for quite large sums of money, we're also, of course, having seen the furniture in people's homes treated with some degree of rarity, almost as an artwork. And then, of course, the film goes back to Chandigarh itself. So objects or items that were of great expense and treated with delicacy and some care become merely useful chairs and furniture to sit on in their original context. The work, as I mentioned, just looking for 2 images, that the work was first installed at Simon Preston Gallery in New York, and that was the first exhibition of the work, but there was a whole kind of project planned which had to do with its exhibition. And so what I decided to do when I was very early on in making the project, it really, when I started going to collectors' homes who collected the furniture, these are also the same people who often collect art. And the proximity of their world and my world felt uncomfortably close. So rather than shy away from this or this project, what I decided to do was to somehow incorporate it. And when I started to realize that, in fact, the auction world, for example, of design is literally next door to the sort of auction world for art, whether it's contemporary art, post-war and contemporary, or that which precedes it. Literally, when I would be filming in an auction house and we would film the exhibition preview of the furniture in the design section, I often had to walk through just to, get a coffee or take a break. We would walk through other parts of the auction house, and I would walk by the contemporary art sale. And it started to really bother me as an artist in this kind of interesting way to start to see the sort of secondary life of artworks. Or the auction house became for me this odd place, like where artworks go, this kind of netherworld, like this Hades-like, netherworld, where objects go between their lives, like from, in between going from owner to owner. And I started to think very heavily about that loop and how objects start to circulate. And then it wasn't just the furniture necessarily, but the furniture is just an emblem, a small part of a kind of giant circle of cultural objects. And so with my own work in mind, my work is editioned and sold, I decided to exhibit Provenance, the film, in the gallery and kind of present a very condensed version of what happens often in the art market, which is that the gallery is the primary market and then the sort of private dealer in the auction world is the secondary market. And artworks often go from one to the other, maybe stopping along the way in a museum that then resells it through an auction house, or it ends up, full stop after an auction house or after the gallery in a museum in the collection. All of these things I became quite interested in, and then took it upon myself to, I'm trying to go forward here, to somehow inscribe this circulation within the piece. And what I decided to do was to limit the edition of Provenance to 5, which is a little bit, I would say, a little on the smaller side of an edition, and offer it at Christie's, London, in an auction, and then film the auction of Provenance and make that part of the work itself. So after it was presented in the gallery for the sort of typical gallery 6-week show, 2 weeks later, it was presented at Christie's in their post-war and contemporary sale. So this is 2013 still. And I knew this was happening, but I needed a way actually to represent this in the gallery show, the sort of the sale that was to come after the gallery show closed. So I made this work called Proof, which is the third part of the project, or this, one of the 3 parts. So Provenance is the 40-minute film is one part, and then you have Proof, which is in fact the embedding of the Christie's auction catalog entry for Provenance in lucite. So it's the auction to come at that moment and they wrote, this is the printer's proof of their auction catalog. And they wrote, the description, and there's nothing staged about this. I asked Christie's to auction it. I explained the project to them. They seemed, they're not stupid. They understood that it was an artist's work, and they wanted to participate. And so they wrote the catalog entry in their kind of Christie's ease, which is to push, elevate artists to their greatest acclaim so that they can sell the work. And then came full circle by filming the auction itself, which I'll show you. This is a still, but I'll show you an excerpt from. Here we are. The name of all of these pieces are called Provenance, these 3 parts, but they also have individual names, just to be really confusing. And this is called Lot 248, which is simply the auction lot number assigned to Provenance. So you can see there's a bit of a frenzy around the work, which I can only explain sort of as follows, which is when when Provenance was exhibited in New York in the gallery exhibition, there was an edition of 5, but the first in the edition was set aside to be sold at Christie's. It was always set aside. But what happened is by the time the show closed, all the other editions had sold. So it was the only one left. And so it became a sought-after item. And there was a list of, sort of unusual, but a list of sort of museums vying for it and private collectors. So it led to this. And I had no way of predicting that. It was just kind of luck that happened. I was terrified that it would not sell. There would be a pass, and I would have like 2 seconds of, average auction time is something like the average lot has 7 to 12 seconds. So that would have been a very short video. So when I show the work after the initial gallery exhibition, this is the exhibition of the work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I show Provenance, the main 40-minute film, on a kind of floating wall here. And here's another image of that in a kind of collector's home. Forgive me for racing through these images. And then I show Lot 248 on the reverse side, most of the time. So you see the work, and then you go around the other side, and you see a work that's all about auctions, and then you see the auction of the work that you just saw. And proof, the lucite piece, is usually exhibited somewhere in the room. I've also exhibited them on separate walls, so that you see one, and then you somehow come to the other at sort of half scale of provenance. I'm not sure how this got in there. There are other sort of offshoots of this project. I made a book which you can view in the gallery downstairs on the bookshelf. I made an artist book called Catalog, which purports to be a catalog, an exhibition catalog of my work, but is in fact a catalog composed entirely of auction catalogs featuring the pages that have the Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret furniture at auction. So all different auction houses. It's scans of their auction catalogs. And then the last page is the auction of provenance and the catalog page from Christie's. From that work, from provenance, which in some ways follows, very much the circulation of objects as they shift from one context to another. And what happens to objects when they shift context? How does their value change? That was kind of one path that I was interested in going down. And then another was this sort of strange question of a kind of modernism elsewhere. What happens to Western European ideas of architecture when exported into a different place? So another kind of shift of context, right? But the object becomes, in a sense, canonized architecture, canonized genre of architecture. And in this instance, a modernist one. What you're looking at here is probably a somewhat familiar image to some of you, because it's Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, which is located in Poissy, outside of Paris. But yet there's something very odd about it, which is that it's dark. And the Villa Savoie, as I'm sure those who visited know, is a gleaming white object. It was designed as a residence and is now a museum unto itself. So you visit the Villa Savoie to see the Villa Savoie. I made a work in 2015 called Double Negative. And the work is composed of a synchronized kind of double 16 millimeter projection and a color HD video. And here you can see one sort of half of the 16 millimeter projection. You can actually see the two projectors because they're facing in opposite directions here. And you see one of the projections on the left. Or I guess, yeah, that's your left. And this is the other projection on the right. And what's sort of unfolding here is I had read a while ago about a group of architects who are based in Melbourne who decided to build a copy of Le Corbusier's white Villa Savoie in their native Australia, in Canberra, in black. So they made a black copy of the white building. And this fascinated me, that they would both make a copy and also make it a kind of negative, or like a sort of shadow version in the other hemisphere of this canonical sort of idiom of Western architecture that's in Western Europe. And so I went there and I filmed on 16. I filmed a kind of shot choreography of the exteriors of the building, and in black and white 16. But I asked my motion picture laboratory, when they processed the film, to print it as negative. So the white building turns black, and in effect, the black building turns white. So in fact, this one is the Australian, and this is the original French. So you have a kind of inversion. I'll show you, they're silent, this projection. So I'll give you a sort of simulation of what this looks like. Meaning they're side by side here, and they're usually opposite each other on those kinds of small screens that you saw images of. So the camera is always placed in the exact same relationship to the building, but the rule that I followed was no matter what is there, I would film. So if there was a tree in the way or a branch in the way, we still sort of went forward. The building's not an exact replica. It's about 82% scale, and it's made of steel, the black copy. But remember, the black one is on the left, and this is the original white. I mentioned that in addition to the 16 millimeter double projection, there's a color HD video. And what happens is the film that you saw is all the exteriors. And the video has the exact same sequence of shots. But then it goes inside. It goes inside both buildings. Inside the white Villa Savoie, as I said, is simply a museum of the Villa Savoie, which features lots of furniture by Le Corbusier and photographs of Le Corbusier, etc. And when you go inside the black one, however, what you encounter is, in fact, and this is the whole program of the building, that this black copy of the Villa Savoie in Canberra, Australia, houses the Institute for Torres, Strait Islander and Aboriginal Studies. It's an ethnographic institute, so dedicated for the most part to Aboriginal communities. And it houses, and this is obviously a color image from the video of the front of the building, of the facade of the building. But what it houses, in fact, I thought when I went there and visited, I actually first visited on a Sunday, and it was closed, obviously, but that was the only day I had when I first read about this. And so I just went around the exterior of the building, and I thought, okay, great, so I can do what I want to do, and I'm going to plan this double 16 mil thing, and I'll figure out, I thought it was like offices inside. That's what I figured the Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies would be, offices and a library. But then when I looked closer online, I realized that they had a collection. They had a collection of artifacts, and they had a collection of media. And by media, it seemed like they had 16 millimeter films, they had video, they had slides, they had actually quite old recordings, and that for years, anthropologists and ethnographers had been depositing their visual and audio ethnographic materials at the Institute, and the Institute has been archiving them. So they have this kind of massive, massive archive, and they themselves had their own film unit at a certain point in the 70s, where they created their own ethnographic films out in the bush, so to speak. So when you go inside in the video, what you see is, in fact, the activity that's happening inside this copy, inside this building that is a copy. And their entire activity has been dedicated for the past several years to copying all of that analog media they have to digital. So in fact, the institution that is itself a copy is dedicated all day long to an act of mimesis, which I found kind of incredible, and that you witness once you go inside the building. So the video itself starts to reiterate this strange kind of system, or this feedback loop of copying or documentation. And then, of course, these are some of the slides they put on the scanner, which you can see this woman scanning here. And they photograph their objects and artifacts. Here's some of the and it's extremely high tech in there. Not that a laptop is, but I was quite astonished to see that they had, for example, this is obviously an image of both the projectors, but that they had, this is an installation view of the HD video, a Spirit telecine, which is a really, really, really expensive machine used to transfer 16 and 35 millimeter celluloid film to digital. And they're quite well funded. And so as the sort of culminating act of this mimetic kind of process work, I asked them to transfer the positive image of the white Villa Savoie on their own transfer machine. So inside of the black building, the white one is kind of being copied and circulates through. You can see it sort of circulating through their system here. One of the unexpected things that came about when making this work was the strangeness of, in fact, there was another layer of copying that was happening, which is that though I knew that I was making an artwork and that I and my crew were very much engaged in that, we also were, in a sense, performing as well, because we were sort of performing as almost an ethnographic documentary film crew. But the tribe or the community or the people that we were filming were the people who were working in the archive and who were handling those materials. So there was a kind of another level that comes across through, unlike most of my other work, which is engaged in these long parallel tracking shots, such as you'll see in Quarry, or if you saw Provenance when it was exhibited at the Vancouver Art Gallery, you probably picked up on that. This is very much static shots, almost entirely static shots, I think, to kind of reiterate that seemingly objective tripod-based gaze that the static shot sort of purports to be. And this brings me to Quarry, which, whereas double negative, follows out of a very particular path out of Provenance, Quarry takes up another path, but it also follows materials, but what it follows is the material, in fact, of marble. So the work begins in the largest underground marble quarry in the world, which is in Vermont, but most marble quarries are on a mountainside, they're not underground. And it traces that marble to its kind of ultimate destination, which is, after seeing the sort of production and quarrying of the marble, you are in fact deposited inside the luxury Manhattan developments where the marble is deployed. It's deployed as backsplashes, countertops, sinks, etc. When I started this project, I went around to a lot of in Manhattan, one of the sort of strange phenomenon of the past several years is that it seems to be a rite of passage in the star architect's life to make a Manhattan skyscraper that's a luxury condo development. And so I went to the showrooms of these developments. And I was very interested in the showrooms they kit out the showroom as this kind of luxury apartment. So you can see what you're gonna buy, essentially. And these showrooms are built inside of office buildings. So in fact, they often have double windows. Like they build in the window of the building to come that they're selling to you, It's all a speculative act. And then they, furnish it and they lay it out as an interior of a building they have yet to build, which they're selling to you, a floor plan, and of course a lifestyle. And when I went to these showrooms and started to visit, I had a really interesting experience at a building that I didn't include, in fact, which is the tallest, speaking of the largest underground marble quarry in the world, the tallest residential building in Manhattan right now is Raphael Vignoli's 432 Park Avenue. And when I went to the showroom for that, I went with my producer, Andy Fierberg, and I walked around and we looked at everything and someone took us on a tour. And when this salesperson for the showroom brought us into the bathroom, he explained that the bathroom sink was made of a single piece of marble. And in fact, the sink itself was just a void, a kind of minimalist void cut into the marble. And we kind of looked at that and commented, yeah, that's very interesting. And then he said, and this marble comes from the same quarry in Italy where Michelangelo took his marble for the Djavads. And we were just stunned because it was such extreme bullshit, of course. But we were stunned also. I was just kind of flabbergasted because it really tried to do something that took me a while to sort of put together why it was so disturbing. And then I realized it was because they were trying to equate the materials of like these sort of luxury materials for luxury developments to works of art. That somehow, if you have this marble, that Michelangelo used for the David, you are able to yourself obtain something through material, through an object, that has the spirituality of an artwork. And that seems to me the essence of what they were selling. And that sort of was the key motivator for my project. So whereas the first half unfolds in the quarry, the second half unfolds in these showrooms, which may look like apartments, but then are revealed through subtle means to be the showrooms themselves, for apartments and buildings yet to be built. But here's some installation shots. And the piece was first commissioned by the Haus der Kultur und der Welt in Berlin for an exhibition called Wohnungsfrage, or the housing question, that was curated by Nikolaus Hirsch and Hilla Peleg and Jesko Feser and Wilfried Kuhn and a team of others. And was quite a sort of unique experience to participate in and have this work kind of juxtaposed with ideas of the home, right, and housing, which all took a much more socialist, materialist perspective than what this work looked at, let's say, in terms of the kind of luxury development and the very, at least it seems to me, North American phenomenon, though perhaps you could say similar things are unfolding in Europe and London in particular. I'd love to open this up to questions now. I've heard that you guys don't ask questions, so I want you to totally contradict that.
Hello. But also if people could wait until one of us come to you with the microphones because we're recording it.
I guess I'll get things going as usual. Hi, and thanks for the talk and thanks for the show. More so even than New York, in this city, economically, if not intellectually, the worlds of art and the world of real estate are the same world. And it's amazing. New York, they're linked. Here, they are the same world. You were showing in the Audain gallery a developer who never once has scooped out marble basins like you saw. But they're basically the same world here in terms of the operative people, the collectors, the key funders, and so on. Now, in the 19th century, I don't think anyone would propose that real estate and art are the same world. What's happened?
I don't think they're that separate in New York, first of all. And then a lot of the people I had to approach for access to the showrooms wasn't so hard for me because they were trustees at museums. And it was sort of easy to get to, but really awkward to make that kind of proposition. But of course, they were sympathetic in some way. But I think what's happened in some sense is, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think what's happened is perhaps the instrumentalization of art, towards, which isn't maybe new, of course, but toward a kind of different, a really kind of cold aim or cold end. The aim is a cold end, let's say, which is, the sort of capital goal. It's interesting because what I'm thinking about actually has to do with provenance, because I think for me, I had this funny experience when I was making provenance where when there was one chair by itself in somebody's home, no matter how lavish the home, the chair felt like an orphan. And it was sort of brought in, divorced from its context, but it spoke back to the context from which it came, right? It was sort of synecdochic, like it was a part that spoke to a whole, like a ruin does, and it somehow tells you about the entire building that's missing, right, around it. And that is a kind of space of mystique when it comes to the Le Corbusier genre furniture, because it's a Western European modernist architect, the canonized one of many, or of few, laid over with the patina of the exotic, of the East, right? So it's really a sort of a strange loop. But when there were multiple pieces of the furniture together, they became kind of like a menagerie. And in that respect, this is what I think connects to your question, is that it's not an educational or scientific menagerie. It's not there to kind of show off the aspects of the rest of the world the way sort of anthropological museums do, et cetera, or encyclopedic museums. It was there as a display of wealth and taste, that kind of 18th century, like Schönbrunn in Vienna, where you collect animals. But here you have the furniture, and the animals are from far away, from exotic places. And that display of wealth and taste is, I think, a part of what's at work in this, right? But there's something about the dissolution of the boundary between art and design is also kind of at play, and I think is a productive space to think about, in terms of, it all comes down to functionality for me. Like an object moves, it moves places in terms of its meaning when it becomes functional or when it no longer is functional, right? So no matter what it is. And that issue of the sink is really curious, that anecdote that I told, because it is entirely functional, but they sort of make it into something that's not. I don't know if I'm answering your question, because it's a really curious one, but I do think it has to do with a certain instrumentalization, of the artworks. And also the apartments themselves, these apartments that ultimately get bought, the real ones that get built, they're funny because often they're left alone like artworks, except, the way that collectors collect work and put them in storage forever, and then they resell the work at auction. The apartments function that way, like safety deposit boxes. So there's another similarity there too, and I think that has to do with this idea in the asset class, the class that's always working to gain more assets, further assets, and then flip their assets to create more assets, that the sort of artwork and the condo are in the same space, exactly. Like there's no difference, right? Which is, of course, chilling as an artist to experience. Maybe that's why the images are sort of chilling, although I find them humorous in Quarry. Yeah.
Do you own any of the furniture?
The Shandigarh furniture?
Yeah.
No.
No.
No, I mean, I'm really agnostic about the furniture. Like, I just don't have an opinion. I like when people tell me, like, they're horrible. Like, like major design curators, like, they're awful. Or other people like, oh, the profile is so fantastic and so brilliant. And I just have no ability to, it's just not entering in that zone for me. Because for me, it's all about how it's inscribed in culture and how it's read, as an object of value, or how it became valuable and what's the value or what's the lack of value. I'm not interested in assigning value to it. I'm interested in depicting the differences of the values.
When you talk about tracing the provenance of the furniture and you say back to its source in Chandigarh, but was it actually made in Chandigarh or was it made in Europe and then shipped to Chandigarh?
It was made on site in Chandigarh, actually, and from local materials. And don't think that, art historians, architectural historians, furniture makers, designers haven't glommed onto that fact as some sort of idea of, like I hear there's something called the 100-mile diet here, like a kind of version of that, like local materials, right? That sort of retroactively they've assigned that to this history, which probably had a lot more to do with budget and practicality than perhaps much else, maybe some aesthetic decision in there. But the interesting thing is that there were supposedly 10,000 pieces of furniture made for the city, according to about 120 designs by Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret. Right, so if you have 120 designs, then you have a certain amount of each design. And of course, there are prototypes that are rare, in terms of collecting, et cetera, because they were the prototype. But 10,000 pieces of furniture is not, it's not IKEA, of course, but it's not a singular artifact or an addition of 5 or 10 or even 20 or an 100 print multiple. That's a large number. And they say some, many, many thousands were destroyed somehow over time. Like if you've seen the work, you'll see that, of course, people working in the offices in Chandigarh, this is not ergonomic furniture made for working at a computer. It was made in the 50s, right? And it's sort of a different idea of clerical work and what you would need, at least in terms of the office furniture. And I think they're just old for people there. And so there's a lot of scenes of discard as much as use, that they're discarded, that they're sort of undervalued. But of course, the need for, what is needed has changed. They simply want comfortable furniture. Can you wait for the microphone?
Here it comes.
Sorry.
Come on. Just a second.
I was quite fascinated in the film of Provenance about the fact that it was just basically down to the wood, so that it's really a reconstruct.
You mean in the sort of restoration
Yes.
scene?
It's not quite restoration because it's almost everything was gone except the frame, whether it was a settee or a chair or a table. And by the way, Georgia O'Keeffe in one of her houses in the Southwest made one out of plywood, the table.
You mean a copy of it?
No, she thought it was hers. But the kind of, never mind, I'll talk to you later about that.
Yeah, I want to know about that. I was there recently.
I'm just curious about, they are so redone. And if you think about modernist furniture, the value of of modernist furniture is it has to have the original leather, it has to have the original this, that, and the other. This has nothing original other than its base.
Yes, I think that's exactly what that scene provokes, is that question of authenticity. That's very central to the project, because if a work's, value is determined in some way by its authenticity, as well as its rarity, right? Then seeing the settee, which is laying on its back here, be sort of violently stripped down to its bare parts, is quite disturbing, and then see it recovered, because then you do question, well, what is so valuable about this? But that, to me, is kind of the crux of it, because I don't know if you're buying into the material so much as you're buying into, as we said about the sink, the idea, the spirituality of it that comes with the architect, the canonization, the context, the aesthetic movement, with which it's associated, with which it will be located in the chronology of art history over time, right? So there's much kind of, it just kind of keeps moving outward, right? Like you throw a stone in the pond and the circles keep widening. It was said to me by a dealer who I worked with to film in his workshop. He has a gallery in Paris, and then he has a workshop where they restore the furniture. And he's one of these sort of original dealers. There was a kind of group of French dealers who started this furniture trade, let's say. And he said to me, well, you know, I've seen pieces where the only thing that's original to this item of furniture is a single screw. Because they get rebuilt from parts, right? Like if there's a desk, a massive desk, like in the law courts, there were these judges' desks that were quite enormous. And not so many exist anymore, supposedly, and some are in quite bad shape. So they'll take part, like you would with a car, when you crash the car and you need a new door and it comes from another car, the same model. That's what they did. They brought the drawers over from the other desk and they put them in, let's say. So you get something that's reconstituted from multiple different pieces of furniture, which is another way in which it kind of challenges the idea of what's authentic. But I think that scene really, gets to that. And the dealers who I spoke about, these are the same people who started really the market for modernist furniture. And I'm talking about going back to Jean Royer, Jean Prouvé. They created a market for that kind of furniture in Europe. And then once they had kind of found the furniture and sold through a lot of it already to their clients, found furniture in France, in the projects that they did in Europe, that those architects and designers did in Europe, they started to go to other countries where those architects and designers had done projects or buildings or schools and pull the furniture from there. So they'd go to Africa, they'd go to Brazil, and they would start selling that furniture. And I think once they exhausted the Prouvé market, and there was definitely an ongoing moment of kind of fatigue and things being oversold, Chandigarh came, and the Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret furniture came like a kind of godsend because its supply was seemingly infinite. And yet they could create a kind of culture of rarity around it, simply by association with the architect. There's a bench back there.
Do you see yourself revisiting Provenance, given that there are, I guess, 5 editions still in circulation? If there were to be any kind of interesting moves, do you see yourself revisiting the artwork at all?
Possibly. I'm open to it. It's sort of like I'm aware of it, and then it's kind of like never say never. And there are 2. Wait, are there 2? Yeah, there are 2 that are with private collectors. So that is the place where it holds the most possibility that they're gonna flip it, I guess, or something like that. So I have it in mind in some way, but in another way, of course, I want to keep my distance. I hope it doesn't. If it happens, I hope it doesn't happen for a while. But I also hope it kind of happens in my lifetime, so I can think about whether I want to do something with it.
I'm just curious. There were scenes in Providence in Chandigarh, where the furniture was like damaged furniture that was piled up.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that they didn't really fix the furniture once it got to a certain point. Is that the furniture that they shipped over to be redone, or did they get other furniture?
Well, the furniture is of such a massive quantity that, we're talking about furniture that's in the government girls' school, the high court, the parliament, the residences, the university, the 35 university buildings, including the library and the temple and the Gandhi Bhavan, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't say there's a singular, it's really quite, there's a lot of subtlety and difference in terms of who does what with their furniture, and whether you're a government civil servant, right, or you're a professor, or you're overseeing, the upkeep of your classroom, or, it's so varied. I couldn't say. But from my experience, it was like I was kind of amused when we went to the university, because it was like there was a corner where all these chairs were piled up to the ceiling, but it was clear somehow in the way that they were piled that students had done it. And it was funny because it's like, yeah, what you do with your, like when you're crazy, you're just kind of like having fun and being a little reckless and anti-authoritarian and just, piling up your furniture outside of your classroom. But that was also quite different than other spaces where it was clearly, we need to shove this furniture out of view. Like on top of the high court, there's a long tracking shot in the piece on top of the court where it's this kind of outdoor terrace, and it's underneath a kind of open air eaves. And there, the furniture, a couple years ago, I think around 2012, right before I think right when I started the project, so maybe 2011, the furniture became designated heritage items. So what that meant is that it couldn't leave the country anymore, and what that also meant is nothing, basically, because, of course, of all the things and all the laws you're going to enforce, that's probably not the one you're going to pay the most attention to, especially, in certain countries where there are other problems that significantly and understandably, take precedence. So, after that law was enacted, I was in France and I saw a whole shipping container show up with the furniture. So it certainly transgressed. But there was a sort of a shift, and some of the furniture got put into the Architecture Museum, for example, is on display. And I think there was also a lot of controversy within India about at first there was a kind of a government auction of the furniture. Meaning we just have some old furniture and we want to get rid of it. And that's where the dealers started to get wind of what was happening and coming in and kind of pulling the furniture out. And then there was controversy around the government officials who supposedly were having those auctions and then later selling the furniture to the dealers at probably what was very small prices compared to what they fetched, through the dealers. But it was seen as a kind of part of, rampant acts of bribery, et cetera. So there are so many different ways that story can get told. But I was most interested not in the kind of investigative acts of reportage that journalists were telling about the story, but really kind of making, and I think this is true of most of my work, of making the objects the protagonists and sort of coming at the idea of human intervention, motivation, and action as something that is read through the movement of objects or through the recontextualization of objects and value. And that's certainly true of Quarry as well. Yeah.
I saw Provenance at the VAG and liked it very much. Was very taken by it. But somehow, as this evening wore on, I got kind of more uncomfortable and got this kind of feeling that you're being disingenuous. That after all, you're an artist of some repute, completely implicated in the system, which is really the same system as the one you're describing. And yet somehow, and that's okay.
I don't think I could have said it better myself.
Well, there you go.
I can't say I'm an artist of some repute. That would be weird, but...
but there's a sort of an edge of, and I think I may have lost my line of thought here, but it's as if one's being kind of snarky about something, and yet one's actually part of it and knows about it and understands. I don't know whether it was. Your talk is very straightforward and quite descriptive, and yet it seemed to me to have some kind of funny edge. I'm not explaining myself well enough.
Well, it's interesting because I think that the discomfort that you feel is a discomfort I felt in making the project, and that led me to the idea of auctioning the work itself and kind of addressing addressing my own role or my own kind of function as an artist. Yeah. Right, and that kind of act of reinscription is essential to the project. I don't know if I would have gone through the project or made it in really, I don't know how it would have come out, because I realized that quite early on. But I always like to, as an artist, kind of ride my discomfort. Like, I think that's something I picked up on. I made a film when I was in graduate school at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I made a film looking into people's windows at night called The Sleepers, which is like the only work I still show from that era. I think it's like, you know, there's a cutoff point, right, where you're just not going to show the stuff before that. But in making that work, which I filmed myself, and that's not some great act of technical prowess, but just to say that I was the voyeur because I was the cinematographer, and I was always alone. Well, once in a while I had a sound person, but mostly alone. I got really uncomfortable many times, but I decided to sort of use the discomfort. And in the next work I made after that, which is a feature film called Empathy, which has to do with psychoanalysis, I'm just always interested in how to bring in my own implication in the project as a kind of motivating question or performance in the project itself. And so, for example, when I spoke about Double Negative, where we're kind of filming the archive of ethnographic films, and we ourselves become, you know, in a sense, a copy of an ethnographic film team, and that's one aspect. It's a somewhat latent aspect, but it's one aspect in the project, you know, that's there, and that is, I think, quite readable through the film's cinematic vocabulary that it deploys. But I think I'm quite interested and open in. I don't want to say it's. I guess in that issue of complicity, you know, and complicity for me is like the motivating question, you know, and how, like when Amie showed DDR, which is a film about former East Germany, the motivating question of DDR was, how do you make a film which is an act of essentially lenses, cameras, microphones, and surveillance about a culture defined by lenses, microphones, cameras, and surveillance. So the works don't deviate that much in that they're always in some way addressing that question of their own complicity in what they're depicting. Sorry, that was a very long answer. Are there any other questions? No?
One more.
I won't do this as a question, just an anecdote, but I think it continues Andrew's point about the blurring of boundaries or the uncomfortable zone between boundaries. The anecdote I'd tell you is the place I hope you go to while you're here, a wonderful artist-run center called the Contemporary Art Gallery. I and some other architects were on the board as it was developed, and we did the interior, or we had people do it, and maintained it as a good neo-modern, clean space. The condo building around it, as it went up, he got so charged about the art world, he named his building the Mondrian. Now, this building is full of postmodern volutes and voussoirs and so on. Absolutely nothing Mondrian-esque about it. And someone pointed this out towards opening, and he had some poor schlub take off the shelf mosaic tiles and make a fake Broadway boogie-woogie in the actual lobby of the apartment building. So there's a kind of fake token Mondrian-esque device there. It doesn't stop there, it's Vancouver. Kitty Corner, the developer, decided to call his building the Gallery and commissioned a very good painter, Tom Burrows, to make three the most ab-exy things he's ever done in nice colors that worked. So that happened. The third corner became the Moreau. So here you have the intersection of real estate and art in Vancouver at the corner of Richards and Nelson. So go take a look.
Thank you. I will. Thanks so much for your questions, and enjoy the exhibition. Thank you.